Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It began with a question. A simple one. But it echoed, louder and louder, until it filled my mind completely. Did I hear something? I should have ignored it. It was nothing. The sound of wind shifting through the trees, maybe, or a car's distant rumble. But it kept coming back. In my small, quiet apartment, a strange tension settled in. The air seemed thicker somehow, and every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet felt wrong. I wasn't paranoid. At least, I didn't think I was. I had a past, sure, things that still lingered, like shadows that wouldn't leave. But that didn't make me crazy. No, that was just my mind playing tricks. It always did that. I sat at my kitchen table, trying to focus on the half-empty mug of coffee in front of me. The steam rose lazily, curling into the air like a question I couldn't answer. The apartment felt familiar, comforting even, but tonight something was different. Something felt off. Then it happened again. A faint thud, just barely audible, coming from the hallway. I froze. For a moment, I was certain it was nothing. Just the house settling. But then it came again, more distinct this time. Thud. Thud. My heart picked up pace, hammering against my ribs. It was getting harder to breathe. I stood up slowly, moving toward the hallway. The dim light of the lamp cast long shadows across the wooden floor. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the door handle. I opened the door cautiously, peering out into the narrow corridor. Nothing. Just the usual quiet. The flicker of a streetlight through the window and the hum of distant traffic. But then, the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was there, a faint, metallic scent, like something burning. My nose twitched involuntarily. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't right either. It was almost as if it didn't belong here, in this apartment. I took a step back, hesitating. Maybe it was the furnace, maybe something with the pipes. But I had lived here for months, and I had never noticed that smell before. The silence felt suffocating now. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew no one could be there. I lived alone. Or at least, I thought I did. I closed the door behind me and walked back to the living room, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the stillness. My apartment had always been quiet, but this was different. It was as if the quiet was hiding something, waiting for me to find it. I couldn't keep sitting still. I had to check again. I needed to be sure. I made my way down the hallway, this time more confidently, my footsteps a little faster, a little more certain. But with every step, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. I paused at the door to the apartment next door, one I had never paid much attention to before. It was always closed. Always locked. The lights behind the frosted glass were dim, but I had never seen anyone go in or out. Not once. The neighbors had always been quiet, and I had never thought to ask questions. It was only recently that I noticed, every time I glanced over, I could swear the door handle was slightly turned, as if someone had been there, but had quickly left. I pressed my ear to the door. There it was again. The sound. It wasn't loud enough to be footsteps, but it was there, a faint shuffling sound just on the other side. I jerked away, my breath catching in my throat. I had to stop. I couldn't keep doing this. There was no one there. There couldn't be. But as I turned to walk back to my apartment, I heard it again. A soft thud, so faint, almost inaudible. It wasn't my imagination. Something was happening. Something was wrong. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. It felt as if the walls were closing in, the apartment pressing on me, suffocating me. Did I hear something? I had to know. But what was I going to find? I stood there, frozen in the dim hallway, staring at the door that I had just heard a sound behind. My heartbeat was pounding so loudly in my ears that I almost couldn't hear the next noise, the sound that followed the thud. It was a faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. I felt my skin tighten, my stomach churn with unease. This isn't right. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to leave it alone, to walk away, to just go back to the safety of my apartment. But that part of me, the one that still had a nagging curiosity and an endless need to understand, refused to let go. I wasn't sure what was worse, the sound or the silence that followed it. The quiet felt as thick as fog, wrapping itself around me and seeping into my bones. It was the kind of silence that makes you question everything around you. Was the world really as I knew it? Or was there something more, something hidden, just out of view? With every passing second, my breath came more shallow, and I found myself stepping closer to the door. It was strange, almost against my will, like my feet were being pulled forward. The apartment had always been a place of peace. Nothing ever happened here, nothing out of the ordinary. But now, it felt like the very air was shifting, bending. Something was wrong, and I needed to know what. I reached for the door handle again, my fingers brushing it just as I heard it, the softest, strangest noise of all. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was coming from inside the apartment, that much was clear. I pulled my hand back, heart thudding painfully in my chest. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. But there was only silence now. Not a sound. Not even the faintest rustle. I pulled away again, standing in the hallway, staring at the door as though it had turned into a looming presence. A dark shape. A puzzle I couldn't solve. Something moved behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing, just the same hallway, the same shadows stretching out. But I knew. I wasn't alone. There was something, or someone else in this building. Maybe it wasn't in the apartment next door. Maybe it wasn't even in the hallway. But it was here, in this place, and it was watching me. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog. Get a grip, I muttered aloud, trying to steady my breathing. It's just your mind playing tricks. You're imagining things. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The air behind me felt thicker, heavier. I turned back toward my apartment, my footsteps echoing through the hallway, but every step seemed louder than the last. It was as though the building was closing in on me. Every door felt like it was hiding something. Every corner seemed darker than it should be. When I finally reached my door, I glanced over my shoulder once more. The hallway was as empty as ever, except for a small detail I hadn't noticed before. The door handle to the apartment next door, the one I had been standing in front of moments ago, was ever so slightly turned. Had it always been like that? The slightest tilt, as if someone had just been there, just touched it, and then walked away? My stomach churned. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to deal with this, with whatever was happening. But I couldn't turn away either. It was like I was locked into this moment, this feeling, this place. I shoved the thought aside and rushed into my apartment, locking the door behind me with a forceful click. I leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed, trying to steady my mind. "You're fine," I told myself. "It's nothing. You're safe here." But even as I said it, the strange, metallic smell lingered in my nostrils, faint but unmistakable. And that whisper, that soft, quiet whisper, it still echoed in the back of my mind. It wasn't gone. It wasn't nothing. I glanced around my living room as if expecting to see the source of my growing paranoia. The light in the corner flickered briefly, a stutter in the otherwise steady glow. My gaze shot to it, and my breath caught. It wasn't just the light. There, in the corner where the shadows met, something was out of place. A slight shift in the darkness, a disturbance. The shadows were moving, just a little, like something was there, something I couldn't quite see. I was standing still now, unable to move, unable to breathe. My eyes were locked on that spot in the corner. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The whisper came again, clearer now. Almost a voice. A low murmur. "You're not alone." And then, with a jolt, the power went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, louder now than ever. And that whisper, it was still there. Closer. Louder. Right behind me. The darkness engulfed me, thick and suffocating. My breath came in short gasps as I stood frozen, every sense heightened in the pitch black of my apartment. The whisper, "You're not alone," was louder now, like it was coming from right behind me. I twisted around, but all I could see was the void of blackness, pressing in from all sides. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I reached out blindly, searching for the lamp on the side table, my fingers brushing across the cold surface. The sensation of the shadows moving, shifting, was still there. It was as though the very air around me was alive, writhing and coiling in unnatural ways. I fumbled for the lamp switch. Nothing. I tried again. Click, nothing. The power was out, but the sense of something, watching me, was unmistakable. My heart pounded harder as if it was trying to break free from my chest. I had to move. I couldn't stay still any longer. I took one careful step forward. The floor creaked beneath me. I froze. The sound was too loud, too sharp in the heavy silence. Then I heard it. Thud, a footstep. Close. Too close. I wasn't imagining it this time. There was someone, or something, right behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and I whirled around again, my hands outstretched, but there was nothing. No one. The air was cold, unnaturally cold, and it cut through the thin fabric of my shirt. I pressed my back against the nearest wall, desperate for anything solid, anything familiar to hold on to. But the chill spread through me, creeping under my skin. That whisper again. Louder now. More distinct. "You're not alone." It wasn't just a voice. It was many voices, overlapping, blending into one. They were low, guttural, like they were coming from the very walls themselves. My heart was in my throat, and I could feel a bead of sweat slipping down my temple despite the cold. I couldn't stay in the dark forever. I had to see what was happening, or at least find the courage to run. I stumbled through the apartment, my hand grazing the furniture as I tried to orient myself in the darkness. My foot caught on something, a chair leg, and I stumbled, falling to the floor with a sharp thud. The breath was knocked out of me, and for a moment, everything was still. But then I heard it. A soft scraping sound just beyond the edge of my hearing. It was coming from the hallway. The sound of something or someone moving. Slowly. Purposefully. I scrambled to my feet, the fear inside me growing into something unbearable. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in. My body was rigid, every nerve firing in panic. The thing in the hallway, it wasn't just a person. It wasn't something I could rationalize away. This was something else. Something darker. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I unlocked it, the metallic click of the latch seeming far too loud in the oppressive quiet. My heart raced. I knew I had to look. I had to see what was out there, even if I didn't want to. The door swung open, revealing the hallway, the same hallway I had walked down countless times before. But now, it was different. The shadows were deeper, the air thicker, and the feeling of being watched, it was almost suffocating. I stepped out cautiously, my eyes darting from one darkened corner to the next. Nothing. The hallway was empty. But the sound, it was still there. That faint scraping sound. It was louder now, almost a dragging motion, like something was being pulled across the floor. I turned to the door of the apartment next door, my stomach twisting in knots. The door handle was now fully turned, as though someone had entered. I didn't think. I just acted. With a trembling hand, I reached for the doorknob, and before I could stop myself, I twisted it and pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, too dark, but there was something else, something I couldn't explain. A faint glow in the corner of my vision. My breath caught. There, in the far corner, was a shape. It was indistinct at first, blending with the shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and disjointed. It stood motionless, facing the wall, as if it was waiting. Or listening. Its skin, if you could call it that, was pale and stretched too tightly across its frame. But what stood out the most were its eyes. They were wide, unblinking, empty sockets, but they were watching me. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. It didn't move. Not at first. But the silence between us was more than just stillness. It was wrong. The air was thick with it. I could feel the weight of the thing, the sheer unnaturalness of it, pressing against me. Then, slowly, it turned. Its head creaked with emotion, like the sound of old, brittle with snapping. The darkness seemed to stretch in every direction as it focused on me. I could feel its gaze, empty, hollow, but there. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I scream? My legs refused to move, my body paralyzed with fear. I couldn't even breathe. The creature, it was no longer just in the corner of the room. It was standing there, in front of me, and it wasn't alone. Behind it, I saw something else. A shadow that shifted, forming into another shape. And then another. Slowly, more and more of them emerged from the darkness, standing just outside the edges of my vision, waiting. I was surrounded. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind, the whisper came again, louder now, louder than ever. "You're not alone." I screamed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My legs were moving on their own, propelled by sheer instinct, by the primal need to escape. My heart was pounding so loudly, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Each step I took felt like it could be my last. The hallway stretched before me, but the darkness felt endless, oppressive. The sound of my footsteps was deafening in the silent void, but there was something else, a low, guttural noise from behind. The scraping had returned, that slow, dreadful dragging sound. And then, faintly, the whisper. "You're not alone." I reached my door and slammed it shut behind me, my hand shaking as I locked the bolt. My back pressed against it, and for a moment, I just stood there, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had happened. The apartment was still dark. The shadows stretched across the room like fingers, creeping toward me. I fumbled for the light switch again, but nothing. The power was still out. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything familiar, anything that could ground me. But there was nothing. Everything felt wrong. I could still feel their eyes on me. Even though I couldn't see them, I could feel them, those hollow, empty eyes, watching from every corner. I was not alone. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. The air was stifling, thick with the weight of something I couldn't name. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my mind racing. What was happening to me? What were those things? Were they real? Was I losing my mind? I tried to steady myself. I had to think. I had to do something. But every time I tried to focus, the sound came again. That scraping noise, now louder and closer. I could feel it moving toward me. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing. I stood there, frozen, listening. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, and just when I thought it was safe, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something, someone, breathing behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but still, nothing. Was I losing my mind? Had all this just been some sick, twisted hallucination? I wanted to scream, to shake myself out of this nightmare, but my voice was caught in my throat. I could barely hear myself think over the pounding in my ears. Then, I saw it. A shape. A shadow in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness. But this time, it wasn't just a vague outline. It was solid, sharp. The air grew colder. I could feel the temperature drop, the chill sinking into my bones. I tried to step back, but my feet were glued to the floor, my legs trembling beneath me. My eyes locked on the shape as it began to shift, moving slowly, like it was trying to take form. I wanted to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the emptiness. The figure in the corner stepped forward. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were elongated, bended on angles, as though it was still in the process of forming. Its face, it was a blur, a dark, shifting mass of shadows that seemed to swallow the light around it. There was no definition, no features. Just nothingness. The absence of something that should have been there. But its eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, they were unmistakable. They were fixed on me, piercing through the shadows, pulling me in. I could feel their weight, the pressure of their gaze. The world seemed to tilt, to bend around me, as if the very fabric of reality was warping under its presence. I took a step back, and then another, stumbling toward the door. My heart was beating so hard now, I could feel it in my throat. I didn't care what it was anymore. I didn't care if it was real or if it was in my head. All I knew was that I had to get out. But just as I reached for the door, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't glide. It shifted. Like a shadow stretching in the dark, it was suddenly right in front of me. Its face was still a blur, but I could feel it now, the presence, the overwhelming sense of rawness that poured from it. It whispered, "You're not alone." I flinched, a jolt of terror shooting through me, and before I could react, it touched me. Cold. Freezing cold. It was like ice on my skin, but it wasn't just on my skin, it was inside me, seeping into my very bones, into my soul. I felt myself freeze, paralyzed, my mind screaming to move, to escape, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing withdrew. It retreated into the shadows, vanishing without a sound. The cold lingered, but the room seemed empty again. The silence was deafening. I could feel my body trembling, every muscle aching with the tension of fear. My thoughts were scrambled. Was it gone? Was it waiting for me to make a move? Was this a dream? But then I saw it. The thing that pushed me over the edge. On the floor in front of me, beneath the faint light coming from the window, was something small. Something out of place. A broken necklace. It was the same necklace I had lost years ago. The one from my childhood. I had left it behind in the woods. But here it was, as if it had always been with me. As if it had followed me. My head spun, and I fell to my knees, my breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But it was. And the thing in the shadows, it was real, too. I wasn't alone. And I didn't know how to escape. I stared at the broken necklace in my trembling hands, the cold metal burning into my skin. My mind was struggling to keep up with what was happening, trying to make sense of the impossible. The same necklace I had lost as a child, the same one I had tossed away in the woods so many years ago. How was it here? How was it in my apartment, on my floor, in the present moment? I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, the air thick with the weight of something unseen, something far darker than I was ready to face. The shadows that had once been distant now felt too close. They pressed in on me from all sides, suffocating, their edges curling and shifting like dark smoke. The apartment that had once been so familiar, so ordinary, now felt like a prison. I glanced back toward the corner where the figure had stood. It was empty. But that didn't mean it was gone. No, I could feel it still. Its presence was lingering in the room, curling around me like a dark mist. The silence was deafening, but underneath it, I could hear it. That whisper. "You're not alone." I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I had to think. I had to do something. I grabbed the necklace from the floor and held it in my hand, staring at the jagged pieces that used to form a whole. Something inside me snapped, a surge of anger and fear mixing into one. I wasn't just going to sit here and wait. I wasn't going to let it control me. But what could I do? I rose to my feet, still gripping the necklace in my hand. My eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that could help me. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing in tighter with every passing second. The shadows danced across the walls, moving in unnatural ways, stretching and twisting. I moved toward the window, hoping to find something, any shred of reality, that would anchor me. But as I approached the window, I stopped. The glass was covered in condensation. Thick, opaque droplets clung to the surface, blocking the view of the outside world. The air was heavy with moisture, but it wasn't natural. It was wrong. I wiped the glass with my sleeve, but the condensation only spread, thicker now, as if something was inside the glass. No, behind it. I could see shapes, figures, but not people. The outlines were twisted, distorted, like reflections of something trying to break through. The shapes moved. No. I turned away from the window, my chest tight with panic. The shadows in the room were more active now, writhing in the corners, swirling in unnatural patterns. It was like they had come alive, responding to my fear, to my desperation. I stumbled back toward the door. My mind was racing, my thoughts fragmented and chaotic. I had to get out. I had to leave, but where would I go? What if the thing was out there, waiting for me? What if it followed me again? You're not alone. The whisper was louder now, almost deafening. I could hear it from every direction, from within the walls, from the floor beneath my feet. It was closing in, tightening around me like a vice. I slammed my hand against the door, but it didn't budge. My pulse spiked as I pulled at the knob again and again, frantic. The door should have opened, but it was locked. Ow! The locks weren't the kind that could just break like that. They didn't jam without warning. And then I realized there was no key on the other side. I backed away from the door, panic bubbling in my throat. The air felt too thick to breathe, too heavy. My head was spinning. This couldn't be happening. None of it made sense. And then I heard it. The scraping noise. Closer now, echoing through the apartment. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. There was movement in the hallway. I could see a shape, a dark figure moving slowly, just beyond the doorway. It was no longer a shadow, no longer an indistinct blur. It was solid, real, and it was coming for me. No. No, no, no. My heart was hammering in my chest as I backed away, stumbling over the furniture, trying to escape. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of stone. The thing in the hallway was getting closer, its form becoming clearer with every step. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs, too long, too thin, dragged behind it like some grotesque marionette. Its face, there was no face. Only darkness, an endless, gaping void where eyes should have been. And yet, I could feel it watching me, that terrible, suffocating gaze. The whisper came again, louder now, like 1,000 voices overlapping, all in one. You're not alone. I screamed, but the sound was drowned by the oppressive silence that filled the room. I had to get out. I had to escape. I dashed for the window, my mind racing. The glass was still thick with condensation, but I couldn't stop now. I had no choice. I threw my weight against the window, desperate to break through. The glass cracked under the force of my body, the shards splintering in all directions. The cold air rushed in, fresh and sharp, but I didn't stop. I pushed through the broken glass, tearing at the window frame, not caring about the blood on my hands. I had to escape. And then, just as I was about to climb out, I heard it. The footsteps. The scraping sound was back, louder, echoing through the apartment. It was too late. I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck, icy fingers that sent a jolt of fear straight to my spine. And then, the whisper came again, louder than ever. "You're not alone." And I knew, then, that I would never be alone again. Have you ever wondered what happens when the night doesn't just cover the world, but consumes it? I don't know when it started, this unease that crawls along the edges of my mind, that tightens my chest with every passing hour of darkness. It's not just the quiet, not just the emptiness that stretches across the streets. No, it's something deeper, something that calls to me from the shadows. Something that whispers from beyond the veil of night. Tonight, the city felt different. The streets I've walked 1,000 times seemed foreign, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the chill of the evening air. My boots echoed against the pavement with each step, but there was something wrong with the sound. Too loud. Too hollow. I wasn't the only one on the streets. There were others, figures, their shapes blurred by the dim glow of streetlights. But they were just as silent as the night itself. They moved in strange patterns, as if they were part of the dark, blending into it, disappearing and reappearing with each passing moment. I was used to the quiet, the solitude. It was my escape, my refuge. But tonight, it felt like the silence was closing in on me, like the very air was pressing against my skin, suffocating me. My name is Ethan, and I walk these streets every night. I know them. I've memorized every crack in the pavement, every shadow that lingers at the corners of buildings. But tonight, it was different. I don't know why I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to turn a corner or look over my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat as I turned down an alley, the narrow passageway dark and oppressive. The streetlights had long since disappeared behind the towering buildings, leaving only the faint outlines of shadows. Then I heard it. At first, it was a whisper, so faint I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, a soft murmur that seemed to float through the air, carried on the wind. It sounded like my name. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. No one else was around. The street was empty, just as it had been moments ago. Ethan. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. Nothing. Just the stillness of the night. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, a trick of my mind. But deep down, I knew. I knew that something was wrong. The air felt thick, charged, as if the night itself were alive, watching me. I quickened my pace, the sound of my boots tapping against the ground growing louder, more pronounced. Every step felt like it echoed through the empty streets, stretching out into the silence. I looked up at the buildings towering above me, the windows dark and lifeless. The streetlights flickered, their dim glow casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to reach out, crawling along the walls as I passed. And then, just as I reached the end of the alley, I heard it again. Ethan. Closer this time. A voice. Low. Almost familiar, but twisted in a way I couldn't explain. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes wide as I turned toward the source of the voice. The alley was empty. There was no one there. The shadows seemed to grow, curling and shifting unnaturally, as if they were alive. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a chill running down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be my imagination. There was no one here. No one at all. But as I stood there, trying to force myself to breathe, I saw something move in the darkness ahead. A shape. It was indistinct at first, just a blur, but then it solidified. A figure, standing just at the edge of the light. The silhouette of a person, but their features were wrong. Too tall, too thin. Their limbs stretched unnaturally, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I took a step back, my heart racing. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure stepped forward, its face still hidden in the shadows. And then, I saw it. Its eyes. Black. Hollow. Empty. They stared at me, unblinking, like two pits of darkness staring into my soul. Ethan. The voice came again, only this time it was closer, right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The alley was empty once again. The figure, the voice, everything, it was gone. Except for one thing. The smell. It was faint at first, just a whisper of something rotten, something decayed. But as I inhaled, it grew stronger, overpowering the clean night air. I covered my nose with my sleeve, but it was no use. The stench was everywhere, clinging to the very air itself, twisting my stomach. I turned, desperate to escape, to get away from whatever was happening. But the alley seemed longer now, stretching out farther than it should have, the walls closing in around me. The shadows moved faster, more erratic, like they were chasing me. I ran. I ran without thinking, my heart pounding, my breath ragged. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. The streets twisted and warped around me, the familiar buildings now looming like towering giants, their dark windows staring down at me. And still, the voice called. Ethan. I turned a corner, my legs burning, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. But then, I stumbled. My foot caught on something that wasn't there a moment ago. I fell to the ground, my hands scraping against the cold pavement. When I looked up, I saw it. The figure was standing there, blocking my path, its eyes empty, its mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, too unnatural. And then, everything went dark. The darkness wasn't like anything I'd ever known. It wasn't the absence of light, nor the quiet of a sleeping city. It was alive. A thick, oppressive weight that pressed against my chest, smothering every breath. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't escape. I don't know how long I lay there on the cold pavement, eyes squeezed shut, my pulse pounding in my ears. But when I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in the alley. It felt like waking up from a bad dream, but I knew in the deepest part of my gut that I wasn't safe. The air had changed. It was still heavy, suffocating, but now there was something else. A hum, a vibration that seemed to run through the ground itself. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling as they scraped against the rough asphalt. The world around me was blurred, like I was seeing it through a fog. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the streetlights I knew so well were now dim and wavering, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty street. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the figure again. It wasn't far, just at the edge of the light where the shadows seemed to fold into one another. At first, I thought it was an illusion, just a trick of the light. But as I took a hesitant step forward, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately. Its eyes still burned into me, black as pitch, like twin voids that swallowed everything they touched. Ethan. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was closer. louder, more real. My body froze. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as it called my name, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't react. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot, as if the darkness itself had sunk its claws into me. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but all I could do was stare at the figure that stood before me, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles, its form swaying like a marionette on invisible strings. I took a step back, my foot slipping on the wet pavement. The figure remained still, its eyes following my every movement. I didn't dare to blink. I knew that if I did, if I allowed myself a moment of weakness, I would lose it. I would lose everything. I took another step back, then another, until I was stumbling backward, my hands pressing against the cold brick of the building behind me. And then the ground beneath me shifted. It wasn't just the feeling of the pavement, of solid earth beneath my feet. No. This felt like the world itself had tilted, like the city had suddenly turned upside down. The air around me thickened, becoming almost suffocating. The sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional whisper of wind, everything vanished. Gone. It was just me and the figure. Ethan. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was inside my head. A thought that wasn't mine, an echo of something ancient and forgotten. It gnawed at my sanity, dragging my thoughts down into a spiral of panic. I closed my eyes, willing it to stop. Please, stop. But when I opened them again, the figure was gone. The alley had vanished. The street had shifted, stretched, bent in impossible ways. There were no street lights anymore, no familiar buildings. Just shadows. Endless shadows, dark and silent, like a sea that stretched to the horizon. I could feel it now, pressing against me. The weight of it. The sense that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure how I knew, but I could feel eyes on me, countless eyes, watching from the darkness, waiting. I spun around, my body thrumming with adrenaline. I wanted to run. I had to get out of here. But the darkness was alive now, shifting, moving. The ground beneath me seemed to give way, like the pavement was softening, the buildings tilting toward me. I turned again, desperate for an exit, but the more I moved, the more the shadows seemed to close in. The walls were narrowing, pressing me in from all sides. The air grew thick, too thick, choking me, suffocating me, as if the very space was shrinking. The voice came again, but now it wasn't just my name. It was something else. Something worse. Come closer. I didn't know what it meant, what it wanted, but I knew I couldn't obey it. If I did, I'd be lost. The figure, no, the thing, was out there. Somewhere, waiting for me. I turned again, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. I could feel it moving, closing in on me, the air thick with its presence. And that smell, it was back. The stench of decay, of rot, of something unnatural. It wrapped around me, sinking into my skin, my lungs. The shadows were moving faster now, swarming like insects. The ground beneath me began to shift again, as if the very fabric of reality was warping. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. Ethan. I looked up, and for a moment, I thought I saw it. The figure. It was standing in front of me again, its twisted form barely visible in the dark. Its eyes glowed, hollow and empty, pulling at the very core of my being. It took a step toward me, and I felt the ground tremble. I had to run. With every ounce of strength left in me, I turned and sprinted into the darkness, my heart hammering in my chest, my body desperate to escape the suffocating weight of the night. My lungs burned as I ran, my feet slapping against the uneven pavement, but it felt like I was running in place. The shadows were stretching, twisting around me, moving like serpents in the dark. Every time I tried to look ahead, the street seemed longer, further away, as if the world itself was playing tricks on me. I couldn't breathe. The smell of decay was stronger now, filling my nose with a nauseating stench that clawed at the back of my throat. I wanted to scream, but I was too terrified, too paralyzed by the growing weight of the night. Someone was out there, and it was closing in on me, its presence suffocating the air around me. Ethan. That voice again. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, but a thundering boom in my skull. It vibrated in my bones, sending waves of nausea through me. I clenched my fists, gritting my teeth, trying to fight it, trying to block it out. But it was everywhere. It was inside me. I turned a corner, my breath ragged, trying to outrun the darkness, but it followed. Always following. No matter how fast I ran, it was there, pushing in from all sides. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The streets I knew so well had become alien, warped, distorted. The buildings were no longer familiar. They seemed to stretch up to impossible heights, their windows like dark, hollow eyes staring down at me. And then I heard it. The footsteps. At first, it was just a faint echo, barely noticeable. I thought it was my own, the pounding of my heart making everything sound louder. But no! These were other steps. Someone, or something, was following me, matching my pace. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, and listened. The footsteps were getting closer. My entire body went stiff, fear taking root in my chest like a vice. I didn't dare to turn around. The very thought of it made my stomach churn. But I couldn't ignore it. The sounds were so distinct now, so real. Click, clack, click, clack. The rhythm of the steps was irregular, like a person with a limp, dragging one foot behind. But there was something wrong with them. Something unnatural. The footsteps weren't entirely human. I forced myself to move again, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to stop. I had to keep running. I had to outrun whatever was following me, whatever was creeping closer with every step. But as I pushed forward, I felt something else. The air had changed. It had turned cold. Bitterly cold. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted around, scanning the darkened street. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it now. The oppressive weight in the air. The feeling of being watched. Of being surrounded. I glanced behind me. Nothing. The street was empty. The darkness was absolute. But that didn't matter. I knew something was there. I could feel it creeping at the edges of my vision, just out of sight, like a shadow that didn't belong. Ethan. The voice, now louder, closer, seemed to surround me, pressing in from all sides. It was like the night itself had become sentient, alive with malice. The darkness was thickening, turning to a liquid that was seeping into my skin, filling me with dread. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to escape. But where? I started walking faster, my steps now frantic. The sound of my breath was deafening, but the echo of those footsteps was louder. Closer. Click. clack. I reached the end of the street, but there was nowhere to go. A high iron gate loomed in front of me, its bars twisted and bent, leading to a small park I didn't recognize. The gate was old and rusted, the air around it still and oppressive. I didn't know why, but something told me to go through. I pulled the gate open, its screeching sound cutting through the night. I stepped inside, immediately feeling the temperature drop further. The park was a labyrinth of twisted trees and overgrown paths, the grass beneath my feet soft and uneven. I heard the footsteps again, and they were right behind me now. The thing was close. I could hear it breathing. It was close enough that I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. No. I refused to turn around. My heart was hammering so hard it was all I could hear, but the footsteps, its footsteps, were louder now. I was trapped. I ran, my feet slipping on the damp grass, my hands brushing against the low-hanging branches of the trees. The darkness was thicker here. It clung to me, wrapped around me like a blanket made of fear. Then, just as I rounded a bend in the path, I saw it. A figure. A shadow. It wasn't human. Not entirely. Its form was long and crooked, like it had been twisted into shape by something far more ancient than time. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, wide and empty, staring at me with an unblinking intensity. I froze. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by the terror, by the absolute certainty that this thing in the darkness, was not real. But it was. It was real. I tried to take a step backward, but the ground beneath me seemed to buckle, as if it were pulling me down. The world around me was beginning to spin, to collapse. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. And the thing stepped forward, its long, distorted limbs creaking as it did. Ethan. I shut my eyes, shaking my head. No. I couldn't do this. Not again. But when I opened them, the figure was gone. The park had vanished. The street returned, the familiar one I had been running down moments before. But I could still feel it. That presence. It was still there, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting. Waiting for me. Was it real? Was any of this real? I didn't know anymore. I wasn't sure I ever would. The street had returned to normal, but my mind was anything but. My pulse raced as I tried to steady my breathing, desperately searching for any sign that I was not alone. The cold air nipped at my skin, a harsh reminder of the terror that had just unfolded. The sound of my own heart thumping in my chest was deafening, but I was certain I could still hear something else, something wrong. I could feel it. It was still there, lurking in the shadows. The air had thickened again, and the quiet hum of the world around me seemed to vanish, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums. I glanced down at the cracked pavement, watching my feet shuffle along in a daze. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop them. I didn't know what I was looking for anymore. I didn't know if I was searching for an escape or for a sign that this was all just a nightmare, a figment of my overstressed mind. The world felt wrong now. The streetlights cast long, unnatural shadows across the road, and the once familiar buildings seemed to stretch higher, their forms bending in impossible angles. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Or had something changed? The voice. The voice had never really left me. It had only paused, as if toying with me, giving me a fleeting moment of false hope before it returned, louder this time, more demanding. "Ethan." I stopped in my tracks. The voice wasn't in my head anymore. It was in the air, all around me. Like a whisper carried by the wind, it wrapped around my senses, squeezing until I could barely breathe. It knew me. I turned around, my stomach flipping in terror, but there was nothing. The street was empty. I didn't know what I was expecting, but there was nothing there. Nothing real. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw someone move. A figure, barely noticeable against the backdrop of shadows, standing just at the edge of the alleyway. I wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light or something more, but I felt my heart lurch in my chest. I took a cautious step forward, squinting to make out any defining features. The figure remained still, its form shifting slightly as though it were waiting for me. I should have turned and run. I knew I should have. But my feet moved of their own accord, slowly, as if drawn by some invisible force. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The figure didn't move. It was a person, standing there. But they were wrong. Their posture was too stiff, too rigid, and their face. I couldn't see it clearly. But the impression it gave me, the sensation it left in my chest, was enough. It was as if this figure wasn't meant to exist in the space I was standing in. It was as though they were an echo from another time, another place. "Ethan." The voice. This time, it was unmistakably coming from it. The figure. The words crawled over my skin like 1,000 insects, chilling me to my core. Who are you?" I forced the words out, but they felt foreign, as though my voice wasn't mine. It came out hoarse, shaky, barely audible. The figure didn't respond, but I could see the faint outline of something shifting in the darkness behind it, something moving, something that was just out of my line of sight. It was here. I took a step back, panic starting to rise in my chest. I felt my mind unraveling with every passing second. Was this real? Was it just another vision, another hallucination brought on by my overwhelming fear? But I couldn't deny the terror crawling up my spine. It was real. Whatever this was, it was real. I turned to flee, but as I did, the alley seemed to stretch, elongating into an endless path. The walls on either side of me loomed taller, narrowing until they were almost closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. The walls were pressing against me, suffocating me. The figure followed me. Slowly. Steadily. Its footsteps, soft but unmistakable, echoed behind me like a drumbeat, getting louder with every step. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. My heart raced. I had to get out. I had to escape. I turned down another alley, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of the madness consuming me. The air around me felt thick and suffocating, as though the very space was closing in, suffocating me. But even as I ran, I could feel it. The presence. I was being watched. And this time, it wasn't just a feeling. I glanced over my shoulder again, and for a split second, I saw it, a flash of something just behind me, moving with impossible speed, its form too quick to capture in my peripheral vision. A long, gaunt figure, with limbs that twisted at unnatural angles. It was there. I broke into a sprint, my legs screaming, my breath ragged as I tore through the alleyways, my heart pounding in my ears. But the thing was faster. I could hear it now, its breathing, ragged and heavy, close, too close. I wasn't alone anymore. I reached the end of the alley where the street opened up, but there was no relief. The world around me had changed again. The buildings were gone, replaced by a vast, empty field. A cemetery, perhaps, but there were no graves, no markers, just endless, barren land stretching out into the distance. The thing was standing there, waiting for me. It wasn't moving anymore, just standing in the middle of the field, its head tilted to one side. The darkness surrounding it felt alive, like it was breathing, pulsing. Ethan. The voice was everywhere now. It surrounded me. It seeped into my skin, into my bones. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but my body was paralyzed, my mind locked in a vice. I was trapped in this endless nightmare with no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The field, the darkness, everything gone. I was back in the street. The familiar street. The one I had started on. But it felt different. Everything felt different. The world around me had shifted. The shadows, the air, even the ground beneath my feet seemed wrong. I turned, hoping to find something familiar, something that would tell me I was safe. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness. And the whisper. Ethan. Was it real? I didn't know anymore. But I knew this, whatever it was, whatever I had seen, whatever was watching me, it wasn't finished with me. Not yet. The world was still. Too still. My body was trembling, shaking uncontrollably as I stood on the street corner. The air hung heavy, thick with the weight of something wrong, something I couldn't name, but that I felt down to the very marrow of my bones. I tried to breathe, but every inhale seemed to get stuck in my chest, as though the air itself had become too thick for my lungs to process. I looked around, but the street was empty. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch, to twist, to move unnaturally. I could still feel the weight of those eyes on me, though. Those eyes that had followed me, that had seen right through me, that had made it clear I was not alone. The world had become something else, something hostile, something that didn't care about what was real. Every corner, every shadow, every crack in the sidewalk seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though the night itself was alive. My vision blurred as my thoughts raced, frantically trying to make sense of it all. But nothing made sense. It couldn't. It was impossible. I could hear it again, the whisper. So faint, so distant, but unmistakably there. Ethan. The voice, familiar yet not, clawed at my sanity, a constant reminder of what was lurking just out of sight. It was the same voice. It had to be. But now it wasn't just a whisper. It was a presence. Something ancient, something far older than me, far older than this world. It was a whisper in the dark, a pull on my soul, a tug at my mind. I stumbled back, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't move. Not anymore. Every time I tried to break free, the world shifted again, as though the ground beneath me was swallowing me whole, twisting, warping. And I was caught in it. I was tangled in the threads of this nightmare, helpless to escape. I heard it, then. The sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Closer. I whirled around, eyes searching, heart pounding, breath ragged. But I saw nothing. Nothing at all. It's not real. I told myself that, over and over, each word a mantra to fight the fear threatening to consume me. But even as I said it, I felt the truth of it slipping away. This wasn't just fear. This was something else. Then the sound came again, louder this time. I could hear the shuffling, the dragging of something across the ground. The steps didn't belong to any human. They were too uneven, too wrong. The sound echoed down the street, bouncing off the buildings, stretching out of time as if they had always been there. As if they were part of the fabric of this place. The steps grew louder, closer, more distinct. And with them, that terrible feeling returned, the sensation that I was being watched. The presence was here. Ethan. It was closer now. The voice, the figure, the presence, it was all merging together into something I could no longer distinguish. The world around me was collapsing, bending to its will. Reality was breaking down. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Every instinct told me to run, to flee, but my body refused to obey. Click. Clack. The footsteps. Closer now, louder. The sound was unbearable, and the weight of it was crushing me. I took a step back, my body frozen with dread. And then I saw it. A figure in the distance. A figure that shouldn't exist. It was standing there, at the end of the street, in the shadows where the light couldn't reach. I couldn't make out any details at first. It was just a shape, a silhouette, but I felt it in my gut. I knew what it was. The same form, the same figure I had seen in the park, in the alley. But now, it was closer. Much closer. Ethan. The voice was almost a scream now, ripping through the air, tearing at my consciousness. It was a command. A demand. It wanted me. The figure stepped forward, its long limbs moving with unnerving fluidity. It moved faster than it should have, its body twisting unnaturally, as though its bones didn't follow the laws of nature. The eyes, those glowing eyes, pierced the darkness, two orbs of cold light fixed on me. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't move. My body was trapped in a state of pure terror, unable to fight, unable to escape. I knew it was coming for me. My heart raced as I backed away, step by trembling step. My feet couldn't move fast enough, my mind was unraveling. But no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I tried to run, the figure was there. It was always there. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The presence was enough. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I found myself falling, tumbling into nothingness. The world spun wildly, disorienting, the air growing colder with every second, until I hit the ground, hard. I gasped for air, but the air was thick, like I was drowning in it. It was suffocating, pulling at my lungs, at my thoughts. I couldn't see. I couldn't think. Ethan. The voice echoed in my mind, louder now, clearer. I opened my eyes. I wasn't on the street anymore. I was somewhere else. Somewhere dark, confined. A small room, maybe? Or was it a coffin? I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold walls. They felt real. Solid. It was real. The walls were pressing in, getting tighter, and I couldn't breathe. My body thrashed in panic, but it was no use. My vision blurred again, and everything around me began to pulse with a sickening rhythm. The presence was closer now. It was here. I could feel its fingers, cold and sharp, crawling under my skin, digging into my mind. I could feel it, could feel the whisper filling me up, suffocating me from the inside. Ethan. The whisper, the voice, was no longer separate. It wasn't distant. It was me. I was hearing my own voice. I was becoming the voice. The world around me fractured. I wasn't sure if I was awake or if this was the end. But as the darkness consumed me, as the figure closed in with its eyes and its twisted form, I realized one horrible truth. There would be no escape. I was already gone. Have you ever stumbled upon something that shouldn't be there, but you can't explain why? Something so small, so insignificant, yet it nags at you, pulls at your insides, until it consumes you with questions? That was how it all began. Thomas walked through the grand entrance of the house for what felt like the 100th time. The house was old, steeped in history, and was now his to renovate. The wooden beams creaked under the weight of the past, but there was something oddly comforting about the way the house stood, as though it were inviting him to discover the stories locked within its walls. It wasn't that Thomas had a particular fondness for old buildings. In fact, he was a man who preferred the straightforwardness of modernity. Yet, when the opportunity to restore this centuries-old house appeared, something about it intrigued him. Perhaps it was the house's secluded location, tucked away on the edge of the woods. Or maybe it was the price, too good to be true, as his friends had joked. But it was the house itself that spoke to him in a way he couldn't ignore. The work had begun months ago. The peeling wallpaper had come down first, revealing faded portraits of ancestors who had long since departed. The old furniture was piled in the corners of rooms, covered in dust and neglect. The air smelled of wood and mildew, yet there was something strangely familiar about it, something almost comforting. But still, every time he walked through the long, empty hallways, a nagging feeling gnawed at him. It was as if something was waiting, lurking just beyond the corner of his eye, behind the closed doors. This afternoon, as he moved through the upper floors, Thomas noticed a door at the end of the hallway that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't hidden, but somehow, in the months of work, he had never bothered to open it. Perhaps it was the thick layer of dust around the doorframe, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Or maybe it was the fact that, despite the renovation, no one had even mentioned this room. It was as if the house had forgotten it was there. But now, standing in front of it, Thomas felt a strange pull, a curiosity that began to outweigh his doubts. He reached for the brass handle, the cool metal against his skin sending a slight shiver down his spine. The moment he turned it, there was a faint click, one that sounded oddly louder than it should have, as if something deep inside the walls had acknowledged his touch. The door creaked open. At first, Thomas didn't see much. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, the only light coming from the faint glow of the hallway outside. It was cold, the air damp and still, like the room had been forgotten not only by the house, but by time itself. As he stepped inside, his footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, which felt unnervingly slick underfoot. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, too still for a room that had been untouched for so long. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and he could make out the faint outlines of old furniture. A rocking chair sat by the window, its seat covered in what looked like decades of dust. A fireplace, long unused, sat on the far wall. The mantel was cluttered with forgotten trinkets, relics of a life that had been abandoned. And then there was the painting. It hung crooked on the wall above the fireplace. The frame was ornate, intricately carved, and weathered with age. The painting itself was a portrait of a woman. But unlike the usual portraits of the house's former inhabitants, there was something strange about her eyes. They didn't seem to look directly at him, yet Thomas felt like they followed his every move. His throat tightened as an uneasy feeling washed over him. He hadn't planned to investigate this room today. He had a million other things to focus on, sanding the floors, repainting the trim, fixing the broken windows, but something about the room, something about this portrait made him linger. As he stepped closer to the fireplace, Thomas felt a sudden shift in the air, a barely perceptible change, like a whisper in the back of his mind. He brushed it off. But when his gaze flickered back to the painting, he realized something. It wasn't just the eyes. There was something in the background, partially obscured by the shadow. A faint outline of a figure, someone standing just behind the woman, but barely visible, as if trying to remain hidden. He leaned in closer, squinting in the dim light, but the more he looked, the more the figure seemed to shift. It was there, and then it wasn't. A trick of the light, surely. But as he reached up to adjust the painting, Thomas noticed the frame had been slightly dislodged, the edges not quite aligned. With a cautious hand, he tried to push it back into place. But before he could, the frame suddenly gave way, as if it had been waiting for him. Behind the painting, there was a small, hidden compartment. Inside it, tucked neatly against the back of the wall, was a small, weathered box. The box was old, far older than anything he'd encountered in the house so far. The wood was smooth and dark, almost too smooth, as though it had been polished over and over again, but its edges were frayed, worn. Thomas hesitated, his curiosity at war with an unshakable sense of dread. The box was clearly important. But why had it been hidden? And what was it doing behind a painting in a room that had been sealed for so long? He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and opened the box. Inside, there was only one thing, a small, tarnished key. For a moment, Thomas stared at it, feeling as though the weight of the house had just shifted. It was as if the walls themselves had closed in a little tighter. There was something familiar about that key, something right. Yet, it felt completely out of place, as if it didn't belong here in this forgotten room. He turned the key over in his palm, feeling a strange chill run through his fingertips. And as the shadows in the room deepened, as the silence seemed to press in on him from all sides, one question burned in his mind. What does this key open? Before he could answer, a sudden sound, distant but distinct, reached his ears. A soft tapping, like the sound of nails against wood. At first, it was so faint he thought he might have imagined it. But then it came again. Closer. In the silence of the forgotten room, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. And this time, it wasn't coming from outside the room. It was coming from inside. The tapping was unmistakable now, louder, sharper, like the rhythm of someone or something fingering the wooden floor beneath the room. Thomas froze, the key still clenched in his palm, as if the simple object had suddenly gained an ominous weight. He glanced around the dim room, his heart thudding in his chest. The tapping didn't make sense. The room had been undisturbed for decades, yet now, in this very moment, someone was making a sound that felt far too real for his already overactive imagination. The air around him felt thicker, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The familiar ticking of the old grandfather clock downstairs, an ever-present sound, was now silent. Everything had stopped. He turned slowly, his gaze darting to the corners of the room. The shadows were deep and stretching unnaturally long. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was as if it was coming from within the very walls. Thud, thud, thud. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. The sound was almost rhythmic, deliberate. like someone was trying to communicate. A chill slid down Thomas's spine. He stepped closer to the fireplace, his fingers brushing against the cool stone, and he stared at the spot where the sound seemed to be coming from. The floor beneath him creaked as he moved, the house protesting every step. His pulse quickened, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not yet. He had to know what was happening. Without thinking, he knelt down and pressed his ear to the floor. The air around him grew colder, the silence stretching thin as his heart beat louder in his chest. The tapping had stopped. For a fleeting moment, everything was still again. Then, as though in response to his proximity, the tapping began again, but this time it was louder, clearer. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was unmistakable now. A steady, measured beat, almost as if it were knocking. As if it wanted something. Or perhaps it was trying to reach him. Thomas felt a wave of unease wash over him. His instincts told him to leave, to run, but something else, something deeper, urged him to stay. The key in his hand seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't explain. He stood up, his legs shaky as he stepped back toward the wall, his eyes scanning the old wooden panels. Suddenly, he noticed something odd. In the faint light of the hallway, a section of the floor near the corner of the room looked different. The wood there wasn't as worn as the rest, its color slightly off, as though it had been replaced at some point. The edges of the boards were uneven, and there was a faint line running across them, almost like a seam. The tapping was now a distant murmur, but Thomas knew he had to investigate. He crouched down and inspected the corner more closely. There was no doubt about it now, this wasn't the original flooring. But why had someone bothered to replace just a small section of it, and why was it hidden away in this forgotten room? It didn't make sense. Taking a deep breath, Thomas pried at the edges of the floorboard with his fingers, feeling the dust and grime caked into the old wood. After a moment of struggle, the board loosened, creaking as it shifted. His fingers tingled as he pulled it up, revealing a small, hollow space beneath the floor. A dark, musty odor wafted from the hole, and Thomas recoiled slightly, but his curiosity overpowered the initial disgust. Beneath the floorboard, a small leather-bound book lay hidden. The edges were worn, the cover cracked, as though it had been buried for far too long. It didn't look like something that belonged in the house, or perhaps it did, but it was clearly far older than anything else he'd uncovered so far. His hands trembled as he reached into the hole, pulling the book free from its resting place. The moment he touched it, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the chill seeping into his bones. He could feel the weight of the book in his hands, a strange heaviness that made his heart race. There was something forbidden about it, like it was never meant to be found. The tapping noise grew louder again, the rhythmic sound now more of a pounding. But Thomas couldn't tear his gaze from the book. Slowly, he opened the fragile cover. Inside, the pages were filled with delicate, swirling handwriting. But what caught his attention were the sketches, drawings that looked almost like diagrams, sketches of rooms, of doors, of windows. And at the center of one page, there was an intricate drawing of the very room he was standing in. A shiver ran through him as he flipped through the pages, each drawing more disturbing than the last. The sketches were detailed, with tiny notations scribbled in the margins. But there was something more. As Thomas's eyes moved over the drawings, he saw faces, faint outlines of faces that appeared in the shadows of the sketches. Eyes that stared directly at him. His breath caught in his throat. The room, the exact room he was standing in, was drawn in perfect detail. But there was something else in the sketch, something he hadn't noticed before. In the corner of the drawing, near the fireplace, there was a small figure. A shadowy, indistinct shape, barely visible. But it was there, in the corner, watching. Suddenly, the book slipped from his hands and landed with a thud on the floor. And the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wanted to run. He wanted to throw the book down and flee, but he couldn't. He couldn't tear himself away from the eerie stillness that now filled the room. The air was thick with a presence he couldn't explain. And then, as if on cue, a low voice whispered through the room, soft but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice was barely a murmur, but it seemed to echo in every corner of the room, vibrating against the walls. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Just the shadows. Just the quiet. And the book. The book that had whispered. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The voice was gone, but its presence lingered, swirling around him like the air itself had become alive with unseen forces. He stood frozen, his back to the wall, the heavy silence now pressing down on him. The shadows in the room seemed to move subtly, as though they had become aware of his presence. The book lay at his feet, its pages still open, as if inviting him to look further, to delve deeper into the unknown. His fingers twitched involuntarily, and despite every ounce of rational thought screaming for him to leave, he found himself kneeling again, reaching toward the book. As he touched the edge of the leather cover, a strange jolt of energy shot through his fingers, a sharp, tingling sensation that made his heart race faster. He recoiled, but something deep inside compelled him to keep going. He flipped the pages slowly, as though the book were watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. The drawings grew darker, more twisted with each turn of the page. Faces emerged from the shadows of the sketches, twisted, contorted faces that stared out at him with hollow, vacant eyes. They weren't just in the drawings anymore, they felt as though they were in the room with him, watching him. The tapping sound, which had ceased moments ago, began again. But now it wasn't just beneath the floor, it was everywhere. Coming from the walls, from behind him, from inside the very air he breathed. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was trying to get his attention, trying to lead him somewhere. He felt a shiver run down his spine, and his gaze flickered back to the corner of the room, the place where the shadows seemed to grow thicker. The air felt heavier there, as if something was pressing against him, forcing him to look, forcing him to move. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the overwhelming need to walk toward that corner. The book remained open in his hands, its pages now eerily still, as if waiting for him to read on, to understand. The figures in the drawings seemed to shift, their eyes following him as he stepped forward. The tapping grew louder. Thud, thud, thud. It was impossible to ignore now. He had to move. His body was moving before his mind had fully decided to. He stood and took a step toward the corner, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The floor creaked beneath him, but the sound was drowned out by the pounding of his own heartbeat. The shadows twisted unnaturally, and the closer he got to the corner, the colder the air became. The chill wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket. The tapping stopped abruptly. Silence. Thomas halted, standing inches away from the corner of the room. He didn't know what he expected to find, but there was something there. Something waiting. His eyes scanned the wall in front of him. At first, it seemed like just another wall, covered in dust, worn down by time. But there, in the center, was a faint outline, barely visible against the rest of the stone. It was the shape of a door, but it was unlike any door he had ever seen. There were no handles, no hinges, just a simple rectangular outline etched deeply into the wall. The tapping had started again, but now it was coming from within the wall, as though the sound was emanating from beyond that door, beyond the stone. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the outline. His skin felt cold, the stone slicked beneath his fingertips. And as his hand made contact, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped again, and for the briefest moment, everything around him seemed to bend, to warp, as if the room itself was stretching inwards. Whisper. The voice returned, but this time it wasn't a mere whisper, it was clearer, closer. It was a low, guttural sound, almost as if the walls themselves were speaking to him. Do not open it. The voice sounded different now, gravelly, desperate. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room was closing in on him. He could feel the weight of it. The shadows were creeping toward him, thick and oppressive, as though they were trying to swallow him whole. The tapping became frantic, echoing through his skull. Thud. 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 The sound was louder now, as if something was on the other side of the wall, trying to break through. The pressure in the room intensified, as though something enormous was pushing against him. Leave. Now. The voice wasn't just in his ears, it was in his mind, burrowing into his thoughts. His heart was pounding so violently he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He stumbled back, but his legs felt like jelly. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, but no matter how hard he tried to steady himself, he felt as though he were suffocating. His hand remained on the door. The outline burned against his palm, an unnatural warmth spreading through his skin. He could feel the energy radiating from it, thick and heavy. The whisper stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, a loud crack broke the stillness. The outline of the door began to shift, as though it were slowly, agonizingly, coming to life. The stone walls groaned, the wood under his feet creaked, and the floor itself seemed to tremble. Thomas's pulse was hammering in his throat, his eyes wide with fear. He couldn't move. The door was opening, but not in the way he expected. It was cracking open, splitting the stone in places, the edges of it writhing like something alive. The tapping was now a deafening roar, an endless pounding that seemed to consume him from all sides. The walls felt like they were closing in. Something was breaking through. A shadow emerged from the crack in the wall, too large, too unnatural. A dark, formless mass, its edges shifting and writhing like smoke. And then, through the blackness, a face. A face he recognized. A face from the sketches. One of the twisted, hollow-eyed faces that had watched him from the pages of the book. It was staring at him. And then it spoke. You should have never come here. Thomas's chest tightened as the face in the swirling blackness grew clearer. It was the same twisted visage from the sketches, distorted, hollow-eyed, but now it was more than just a drawing. It had a presence, a weight that crushed the air around him. The shadow's form shifted like smoke, indistinct, but its eyes, they were the only thing that remained unnervingly clear. The whispering voice that had come from within the walls was now gone, replaced by the heavy silence of the room. His heart pounded so loudly he thought the walls could hear it, his breath shallow and uneven. The temperature in the room had plummeted, the air growing thick, almost suffocating. The shadow's face stared at him, expressionless, and then its lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't human. It was something deeper, more primal, a sound that rattled his bones. You should have never come here. Thomas stumbled back, his legs shaking, but he couldn't tear his gaze away. His mind screamed at him to run, to leave this forsaken place, but his body refused to obey. The room seemed to press in on him from all sides, the walls bending inward like they were closing in, suffocating him in the darkness. The shadow stirred again, its form shifting and distorting. The face faded, and then something else took its place, something more sinister, something that made Thomas's stomach churn. A hand, long and thin, stretched out from the darkness. The fingers were unnaturally long, too thin, as if they didn't belong to any human, but something far older, far more unsettling. It hovered in the air, just inches from his face. The fingers twitched, the nails elongated, sharp as daggers. He could feel the weight of its gaze on him, could feel the pressure of the air thickening around him. His feet were rooted to the spot, as if the floor itself had grown 1,000 hands to hold him in place. The shadow moved, its fingers brushing against his skin. Cold. So cold it burned, a sharp pain like ice carving into his flesh. He tried to jerk away, but it was as if the room itself was holding him there. He wanted to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. The air was too thick. The darkness too complete. Please, he whispered, his voice barely audible. What do you want? The shadow's form seemed to pulse, its presence swelling as it leaned closer. The air grew heavy with an oppressive force, as if the room itself was closing in around him. What I want is irrelevant. The voice echoed through his mind, the words wrapping around him like chains. What you want is what matters now. You disturbed the past, now the past disturbs you. Thomas's chest tightened with an impossible, suffocating pressure, his pulse racing. His eyes darted to the door, the one he had just touched, the one that now felt miles away. But he knew better than to try and escape. Something was stopping him, something unseen, something that made the very thought of movement feel like a crime. The shadow seemed to smile, though its lips never moved. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was the smile of something that had lived far longer than it should have. A smile that tasted of ancient, forgotten things. And then, with a sudden jerk, it pulled back. The hand retreated, disappearing back into the shifting void from which it had come. The shadow recoiled, but it didn't disappear. No, it loomed there, just on the edge of his vision. Watching him. Waiting. Thomas's body trembled violently. He could feel the walls pressing against him, suffocating him, pushing him further into the dark corner of the room. The smell in the air had changed. Gone was the musty scent of old wood and forgotten things, replaced now by something foul. Rotten. Decay. It made his stomach twist and churn. Why are you doing this? He gasped, his voice cracking as panic began to claw its way into his chest. He stumbled backward, his legs finally finding the strength to move, though his feet seemed to drag through the thickening darkness, like wading through molasses. The shadows seemed to shift with him, closing in, creeping along the walls and floor. It was as if the very air was alive, pressing on him, closing him off from everything familiar. He didn't know how much longer he could stand it. The voice came again, but this time it was different. It was lower, more insistent, as though the shadow was growing impatient with his resistance. You've already begun to unravel it, Thomas. Thomas felt his heart lurch in his chest. Unravel what? He gasped. The secrets of the room, the truth of this place. The shadow's voice was calm now, soothing in a way that felt wrong. You touched it, you opened it, and now you will know. He looked down at his hands, shaking as they gripped the book still clutched in his fingers. He hadn't even realized he'd picked it up again. He could feel its weight, its power, as though the book was no longer just an object, it was something more. Something that had a pulse, that called to him. The room is not a room, Thomas. It is a tomb. A tomb for memories, for things forgotten, things that should have remained forgotten. He turned, the pressure building in his chest as he slowly approached the center of the room, his body on autopilot. The air was suffocating now, the darkness wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. His eyes darted from corner to corner, from wall to wall, but it was all the same oppressive, suffocating blackness. You are not alone here, the shadow continued. We never were. And then, something changed. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He could see his own exhale, the cold mist forming in front of him. The shadows on the walls twisted and worked again, their edges sharpening. The air hummed with an ancient energy. Then he saw them. Emerging from the darkened corners of the room, figures began to take shape. Not solid, not fully formed, but there, just on the edge of his vision. Shadows. Faces. A crowd of forgotten souls. They didn't speak, but their eyes were all trained on him, staring with an intensity that burned into his very soul. And in the center of them all, just beyond the shadow's grasp, a figure stepped forward, tall, cloaked in tattered robes, its face obscured by shadows, but its presence undeniable. Leave, before it's too late, the cloaked figure whispered. And even though its voice was faint, Thomas felt every word cut through him like a blade. But it was already too late. The room was changing again, its reality shifting with every passing second. There was no escape now. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the low, eerie hum of the room. The figures in the shadows were drawing closer, their forms becoming more distinct with each passing second, their eyes gleaming like dark pools. He could feel the air growing denser, thicker, as if the very walls were breathing with a life of their own. His mind raced, heart pounding violently against his ribs, but his feet remained glued to the floor. The cloaked figure, still hidden in shadows, moved forward, its long robes trailing behind it like the remnants of forgotten time. The figure's presence was overwhelming, a suffocating aura that made the very atmosphere feel alien, unnatural. Thomas's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, but no matter how he tried, he couldn't look away from the figure. It was as though his mind was paralyzed, trapped in the pull of its dark influence. You shouldn't be here, the cloaked figure spoke again, its voice soft yet commanding. This place, this room, it was never meant to be discovered. The words hung in the air, their weight settling heavily on his chest. Thomas's thoughts spun in chaotic circles. He had thought the room was an anomaly, a forgotten relic of a house too old to hold secrets, but now, in the presence of these figures, he realized how wrong he had been. Why me? Thomas croaked, his voice barely audible as the terror clamped down on him. Why am I the one to uncover this? What is it? The cloaked figure took another step forward, its face still hidden, but the aura of cold that radiated from it pressed harder against Thomas's skin. The shadows around him shifted, swirling like smoke. He could feel their eyes on him, those hundreds of empty, vacant gazes watching, waiting. You've come for the truth, the figure said, its voice now tinged with a sorrowful echo. But the truth is never what you expect. This room holds the memories of those who once lived here, their lives, their pain. And now, you will carry it too. The words reverberated in Thomas's mind, the weight of their meaning sinking deeper. He had known something was wrong with this room, with the house, but this, the growing awareness of its past, was too much to comprehend. The shadows began to move closer, almost as if they were alive, circling him like vultures. His breathing quickened as the realization hit him. The room had never been abandoned. It had never been forgotten. It had been preserved for a reason. To trap memories. To contain the souls of those who had entered and never left. As the shadows closed in, one of the figures stepped forward, this one different from the others. It was a woman, pale and thin, her face gaunt and twisted with an expression of hopelessness. Her eyes locked with his, and Thomas felt a chill settle deep within his bones. "Look at me," she whispered, her voice cracked, yet soft. "Do you see it? Do you feel it?" Thomas's breath caught as he found himself drawn into her gaze. It wasn't just her eyes. There was something in the way she moved, something in the very air she displaced. The room seemed to shift again, the walls narrowing, the light dimming as though the house itself was holding its breath. The woman reached out, her bony fingers brushing his cheek, cold as death. "We were once like you," she murmured. "Curious, foolish, thinking we could control it, wasn't it? But the truth is, there's no escape. Not for you. Not for any of us." Her words were a poison, seeping into his consciousness, wrapping around his mind like a vice. His thoughts spun wildly, his body frozen, incapable of movement. The shadows closed in tighter, and the whispers grew louder, as though the house itself was speaking through them. "You're already one of us, Thomas," another voice echoed from the darkness. "You've touched the room, awakened it. Now I will claim you, just as it did all the others." His body trembled violently. The room, the cursed space, was suffocating him, pressing on him from all sides. He felt his consciousness slipping, his sense of self slowly being devoured by the oppressive force that filled the room. And then, suddenly, everything went dark. For a long moment, Thomas couldn't move. He couldn't feel. The weight of the shadows had consumed everything, light, sound, time itself. There was nothing but the oppressive stillness of the void. But then, a flicker of light. Faint, distant, like a dying ember in the vast, endless blackness. He reached toward it, desperate for anything that might break the suffocating silence. As he did, he felt his limbs return, his senses sharp again. He gasped for air, feeling the tight grip of fear loosen for the first time in what seemed like forever. The light grew brighter, and he could make out a shape, a door, standing in the center of the room. It was familiar, yet unfamiliar at the same time. It was the same door he had seen earlier, the one that had been locked, the one that had felt so distant. Now, it was right there, beckoning him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Thomas stumbled toward the door. His feet dragged, the room still disorienting him with its oppressive weight, but the pull of the door, the hope that it might lead him out, was stronger. As his fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob, a voice echoed in his mind again, cold and ancient. "You cannot leave, not yet." Thomas recoiled, his breath catching in his throat as the whisper reverberated through his very bones. The door, the light, it was all a lie. He wasn't escaping. He was only walking deeper into the darkness. In that moment, Thomas realized the truth. The room wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a trap, and he had already been caught. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.